At 4:30 a.m., I stood barefoot in the kitchen with our newborn sleeping against my chest, cooking breakfast for my husband's family while they treated me like hired help. Then Daniel walked in, looked straight past me, and said one word. At 4:30 a.m., I was standing barefoot on cold tile, a 9-week-old strapped to my chest in a wrap I'd tied with one hand because the other was holding a spatula, and I was frying bacon for people who hadn't said good morning to me in 3 days. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the shouting later, not the papers, the bacon. Because I remember thinking, very clearly, over the hiss of the pan, I used to run a departmental budget of $4 million, and now I can't get someone to pass me the syrup without being told I did it wrong. Charlotte was warm against my collarbone, milk drunk, and finally, blessedly asleep after a night that had given me maybe 90 consecutive minutes of rest. My son, 9 weeks old, and I hadn't slept longer than 2 hours at a stretch since he was born, because somewhere around week 3, my mother-in-law Patricia had decided that a helpful house meant breakfast served at 6 a.m. sharp for however many relatives were currently occupying our guest rooms, and I was the one who served it. I want to be fair, because I've told this story enough times now that I know people assume I'm exaggerating for effect. I'm not. I'll give you the receipts literally later. But first you need to understand how normal it all felt from the inside, because that's the part that scares me most in hindsight, how long I called it normal. My name is Renee Okafor Voss. I'm 34. Before Charlotte, I was a senior operations director at a logistics firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. Yes, my daughter is named after the city where her father proposed to me, which is a detail that will matter more later than you think. I'd built a career on being the person who fixed broken systems, supply chains that had fallen apart, vendor contracts that had gone sideways, teams that had lost faith in their own management. I was good at it. I was, by any external measure, a capable adult who people paid a great deal of money to make hard decisions. Then I married Daniel Voss, and somewhere in the 18 months between our wedding and Charlotte's birth, I became, in the eyes of his family, an appliance. Daniel's family runs a mid-sized construction and property development company his grandfather started, Voss Brothers Development. Not enormous, but comfortable. Patricia, Daniel's mother, still holds a board seat and a significant equity stake, even though she's technically retired. Daniel's father, Gerald, passed 6 years ago, and ever since, Patricia has run the family the way she apparently used to run job sites. Total control, delivered with a smile that never once reaches her eyes. The early red flags were small enough that I explained them away one at a time, the way you do when you love someone and you desperately want his family to love you back. At our engagement dinner, Patricia toasted to Daniel finally settling down and didn't mention my name once. I told myself she was nervous, unused to public speaking. When we announced the pregnancy, she asked, in front of 12 people, whether I planned to actually keep working or focus on what matters now. I laughed it off. I told Daniel it stung. He said, "That's just mom, she means well." When we moved into the house, a 5-bedroom colonial in a subdivision called Ashford Point that Daniel's family had in fact built, Patricia had a key. Nobody had discussed this with me. Daniel said it had always been that way with family properties, that his parents kept keys to all the homes the company had a stake in for insurance purposes. I remember standing in my new kitchen holding a box of wedding china and thinking, that's strange, and then thinking, don't be paranoid, Renee, and unpacking the box. That's the pattern if you're taking notes. Strange detail. Rationalize it. Move forward. Repeat until you're standing in your own kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, making bacon for people who let themselves in through a door you didn't know they had a key to. The first real loop started 6 weeks after Charlotte was born. I'd hired a part-time postpartum doula, Yolanda, 12 hours a week, paid for out of my own savings account. The one thing in our marriage that had stayed entirely mine, a habit left over from a mother who'd taught me to always keep an escape fund, though God knows I never thought I'd need the phrase to mean anything literal. Yolanda helped with laundry, helped me learn to nurse without wanting to cry from the pain, helped me remember to eat. Patricia found out about Yolanda on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Yolanda had texted me to cancel our session, apologetic and vague. Something came up, so sorry, I'll follow up soon. She never did follow up. I texted her twice more over the following weeks. Nothing. I told myself agencies were unpredictable. I told myself maybe Yolanda had gotten a bigger client. I did not, at the time, let myself consider that Patricia, who had, I'd later learn, called Yolanda's agency directly and identified herself as the family matriarch handling scheduling, had simply had her removed from our account. Second loop, 2 weeks later, I noticed baby monitor footage on my phone app showing motion in the nursery at 11:40 p.m. on a night Daniel and I were both asleep downstairs, watching a movie we were too tired to actually follow. I checked the footage the next morning, hands a little unsteady on the phone, telling myself it was probably just the cat casting a weird shadow. It wasn't the cat, it was Patricia, standing over Charlotte's crib in the dark, adjusting the blanket for almost 4 full minutes. I asked Daniel about it that evening. I kept my voice light, testing the water. Hey, did your mom come by last night after we went to bed? He didn't even look up from his phone, probably just checking on her. She does that. She does that, I repeated. How often is that? I don't know, Renee. She loves her granddaughter. Why are you making this weird? Third loop, a week after that, I woke up to find my pantry rearranged, not messily, meticulously. Every can turned label out, alphabetized, the way you'd stage a house for sale. I asked our part-time housekeeper, Marisol, if she'd done it. Marisol looked at me carefully before answering, the way people look at you when they're deciding how much truth you can handle. Mrs. Voss was here Tuesday while you were at your OB appointment, Marisol said. She asked me to let her in. She said it was her house too. Her house too. 4 words. I felt them land somewhere under my ribs. I want to be honest about the physical sensations because I think that's that's the part people skip when they retell these stories, and it's the part that actually matters. My hands went cold, not figuratively, actually cold. Fingertips numb the way they get before a migraine. My stomach dropped the way it does on a plane hitting turbulence. That specific lurch of the ground isn't where I thought it was. Fourth loop, I tried to fix it directly. I sat Daniel down, this was around week 7, 2 weeks before the bacon morning, and I told him calmly that his mother needed to stop letting herself into our home without asking. He got defensive in a way I'd start to recognize as a pattern of its own. She's not some stranger, Renee. She's my mother. This is a family house. It's our house, Daniel. Yours and mine. Charlotte's. Technically, the company still holds a minority stake in the property for tax purposes. You know that. I did not, in fact, know that. Nobody had told me that. I remember the exact moment my understanding of my own home shifted under my feet. The same physical sensation as the pantry cans, the ground not being where I'd been told it was. What does that mean? I asked slowly. For who has keys? Daniel didn't answer that question. He answered a different one, the way he always did when cornered. Look, I'll talk to her. Can we not do this right now? I have an early meeting. He did not talk to her. Fifth loop. 2 days later, Patricia and Daniel's older sister Kimberly arrived unannounced with 3 suitcases, informing me that the guest wing would be theirs for the following 10 days while their own kitchen was being renovated. A renovation I would later confirm through public permit records had been scheduled for over a month, meaning I was the last person in the family to know I'd be hosting. That was the moment the pattern crystallized into something with a shape. It wasn't visits. It wasn't help. It was a family systematically establishing that my home, my daughter, and eventually my time belonged to a structure I had no vote in. I need to tell you about the morning itself now, because everything before this was build up, and this was the detonation. It was day 6 of the 10-day renovation stay, which by that point had quietly become an open-ended stay, since nobody had mentioned an end date in days and I'd stopped asking, because every time I did, Patricia would say something like, "Oh, don't worry about us, we're no trouble at all," while standing in my kitchen directing me to refill the creamer. By day 6, the arrangement had solidified into something I can only describe as a shift schedule, except I was the only one on it. Breakfast at 6 a.m. for Patricia, Kimberly's husband Todd, and their 2 teenagers. Patricia had informed me 3 days in that she couldn't do dairy in the morning anymore and would knead her eggs a specific way, and that the teenagers wouldn't eat a long list of foods I then had to work around. Nobody asked if this worked for me. Nobody asked if I'd slept. I was up at 4:30 that morning specifically because Charlotte had been up at 3:15, and by the time I'd nursed her back down, there wasn't enough time left to sleep before I needed to start cooking, so I didn't try. I stood at the stove with my daughter against my chest, and I watched Kimberly walk past me to get coffee without a word, the way you'd walk past furniture. I watched Todd sit down at my kitchen table and open my laptop, my personal laptop, the one with my old work files still on it, because he wanted to check football scores and his phone was charging upstairs. I said, "Hey, that's actually mine. Do you mind?" And he said, "It's fine. I'm just checking scores," and kept using it. At 6:04, Patricia came downstairs already dressed, looked at the spread on the counter and said, "Is this turkey bacon?" I said regular. "You said no dairy, Patricia. You didn't say anything about the bacon." I said I couldn't do processed meats either. I mentioned that Sunday. She had not mentioned that Sunday. I know this because I still have the group text thread from that week, the one where she listed dietary requests, and turkey bacon isn't in it. I know this now with certainty because months later, a document examiner would confirm the timestamp on that exact message for an entirely different reason. But that morning, standing there with a spatula in one hand and my daughter's weight settling into my shoulder as she started to stir, all I had was the sick, familiar sensation of being told my memory was wrong, again, about something I was almost certain I remembered correctly. "I'll make more," I said, because it was easier than arguing at 6 a.m. with no sleep. That's when Daniel walked in. He'd been upstairs on a work call, an early one, with a supplier on the West Coast he'd told me the night before, though I'd later learn from his own calendar records that no such call existed in his schedule for that morning. He walked into the kitchen in a clean shirt, showered, alert in a way I hadn't been in 9 weeks, and he looked past me, at Charlotte on my chest, at the 4 dishes I was juggling, at the spatula and the bacon and the 11-item breakfast order I was somehow supposed to be triangulating on 90 minutes of broken sleep, and he looked at his mother. "Morning," he said to her. "Warm. Easy." Then he looked at the counter, at the bacon that wasn't the right bacon, and he said the one word, "Renee," just my name. But the way he said it, flat, disappointed, the exact tone you'd use on an employee who'd fumbled a simple task, told me everything about where I stood in that kitchen. Not as his wife, not as the mother of his 9-week-old daughter, as staff who'd gotten the order wrong. I didn't say anything for a second. I looked down at Charlotte, whose eyes had opened, dark and unfocused, the way newborn eyes are before they learn to track a face. I looked at my own hands, steady somehow, even though everything in my chest had gone loud and cold at once. "What?" I said. "The bacon," he said, gesturing at it like I should already understand. "Mom asked for regular. She asked for no dairy. That's what the text said." "Don't start," he said. "It's early. Just fix it. Just fix it." Like I was a vendor who'd shipped the wrong SKU. Like 9 weeks of sleepless nights and a stranger's key in my front door, and a canceled doula and a pantry rearranged behind my back and a laptop opened without asking were all just logistics to smooth over before he had his coffee. I want to tell you I said something devastating in that moment. I didn't. I said, "Okay," in a voice that didn't sound like mine, and I turned back to the stove, and I started a second batch of bacon while my daughter began to fuss against my chest, and Patricia said brightly to Kimberly, "See, it's not hard when she actually listens," and something in me went very, very quiet. Not defeated quiet. The other kind. The kind where you stop reacting because you've started, somewhere underneath the reacting to plan. I didn't confront anyone that morning. I fed the family. I fed Charlotte. I put her down for a nap, and then I sat in my nursery, the one room in the house that still felt entirely mine because I'd painted it myself before she was born. A soft sage green Patricia had told me was a strange choice, very cold. And I opened my own laptop, the one Todd had been using an hour earlier, and I started making a list, not a to-do list, an inventory. I want to be clear about something. I am not by nature a vindictive person. I didn't wake up that morning planning anyone's downfall. What I did was what I'd always done professionally when a system was failing. I started documenting because documentation was the only tool I trusted anymore. If I was wrong about the dairy text, I wanted to know. If I was wrong about the doula, about the key, about the pantry, I wanted to know that too. And if I wasn't wrong, if there was a pattern here bigger than one bad morning, I wanted to be the only person in that house who could actually prove it. I called my cousin Amara that afternoon while Charlotte napped. Amara is a family law attorney, 11 years in practice, based 2 hours away in Raleigh, someone I trusted precisely because she wasn't tangled up in Daniel's family in any way. I didn't call her as a client at first. I called her as family, crying quietly into the phone in a nursery with the door shut, telling her about the bacon, the word, the key, all of it tumbling out in no particular order. She listened for a long time without interrupting. Then she said something I thought about every day since. Renee, I need you to hear this the way I mean it, not the way it's going to land. What you're describing isn't just a rude in-law situation. If there's a legal interest tied to that house, an equity stake, a lien, anything, and they're using a key to that interest to access your home without your consent, that's not family being family. That's a documented pattern of a controlling third party asserting rights over your residence and your child. I want you to start writing down dates. Everything. Today. You think this is, what, actually illegal? I think, she said carefully, that I want you to talk to someone who specializes in exactly this before you talk to anyone else. Can you get your hands on any paperwork about the house, deed, mortgage, anything with the company's name on it? I told her I could try. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went looking for the deed. I found it in Daniel's home office, in a filing cabinet he'd always kept locked, except the key lived in a drawer in the kitchen that everyone in the house apparently knew about except me, because I'd never had a reason to go looking before. What I found took my breath away in a way I didn't expect. I'd braced myself for something bad. I wasn't braced for what was actually there. The deed to our house wasn't in Daniel's name and mine. It was in the name of Voss Brothers Development, LLC, with Daniel and me listed as residential occupants under a company lease-to-own arrangement dated the week after our wedding, an arrangement I had never signed, never seen, and never been told existed. My name appeared exactly once, on a single line, in a signature block that had clearly been prepared for me to sign at some point and never was. Daniel's signature was there. Patricia's, as company officer, was there. Mine was blank, which meant, on paper, I had never actually consented to anything about how this house was owned, occupied, or accessed, which also meant, more chillingly, that legally, in the eyes of whatever documentation existed, I might have no more standing in that house than a long-term guest. I sat on the floor of that office at 11 p.m., with my hands shaking, actually shaking now, not the metaphorical kind, and I photographed every page with my phone before returning the folder exactly as I'd found it. Then I found the second thing, which mattered even more. Tucked behind the lease documents was a folder of financial statements, quarterly distributions from Voss Brothers Development to family members holding equity, going back 3 years. Daniel's name was on those distributions, substantial ones. Numbers I'd never seen reflected in our joint accounts, our joint tax filings, or any conversation we'd ever had about our actual household finances. For the 18 months of our marriage, Daniel had told me, repeatedly, that the company barely breaks even most quarters, and that his own salary, a modest one by his account, was essentially all we had beyond what I brought in. I photographed those too. Then I put everything back and went to bed beside a man I suddenly wasn't sure I knew. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of my life, and I say that as someone who just had a baby with a rocky delivery. I had to keep functioning, keep nursing, keep sleeping in 90-minute increments, keep smiling at Patricia over breakfast, while quietly building a case I hoped I'd never have to use. I brought the photographed documents to Amara in person, driving 2 hours with Charlotte asleep in the car seat, the first time I'd left the house without telling anyone where I was going in the entire 9 weeks since her birth. Amara spread the pages across her conference table and went quiet for a long moment. Renee, she said finally, I need to bring in someone who does forensic accounting. What you've shown me suggests there may be a pattern of undisclosed marital assets and possibly deliberate misrepresentation of income during your marriage. That has real implications. For a potential separation, yes, but also for whether anything about this lease arrangement was ever legally binding to begin with. She introduced me over a video call 2 days later to Priya Nanda Kumar, a forensic accountant with 16 years of experience, most of it in matrimonial and closely held business disputes. Priya was calm in a way that steadied me almost immediately, the kind of calm that comes from having seen worse than whatever's currently making you shake. Send me everything you photographed, Priya said, and anything else you can find, bank statements, tax returns, anything with the company's name on it. I want to trace where the distributions actually went, because if they're not reflected in your joint filings, there are only a few places that money can be. It took Priya 9 days to build what she called a preliminary picture. 9 days during which I kept cooking breakfast, kept getting corrected about bacon and dairy and creamer, kept watching Todd use my laptop and Kimberly walk past me like furniture, and Patricia let herself into rooms with a key that I now understood might not have been hers to hold in the first place. What Priya found? Over 3 years, Daniel had received just under $340,000 in equity distributions from Voss Brothers Development, funneled into an account I had never known existed, opened 4 months before our wedding, in his name only. Some of that money had gone toward the down payment structure of the very house I was living in, meaning Daniel had personally financed part of our family home through funds he'd hidden from me while telling me the house was a company-held property he had no real financial stake in beyond his salary. This isn't just non-disclosure, Priya told me and Amara on our third call. This is a documented pattern of separate financial structuring designed, at minimum, to obscure marital assets. Whether it rises to fraud depends on intent, which is a legal question, not an accounting one. But the paper trail is clean. I can testify to every dollar. I remember sitting with that phrase, I can testify, and feeling something shift in my chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to the feeling of finally understanding a diagnosis after months of unexplained symptoms. Bad news, but clarifying. The ground, finally, telling me the truth about where it actually was. The crisis peak came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the bacon morning, and it came faster than I was ready for. Patricia and Kimberly's 10-day stay had, by then, stretched to 26 days with no end in sight. And that morning, over the usual breakfast shift, Patricia mentioned, casually, the way you'd mention weather, that she and Daniel had been talking about formalizing some things, and that it might make sense for the company to take a more active role in managing the household, given how much they were already contributing. Managing the household, I repeated. Groceries, upkeep, that sort of thing, Patricia said, buttering toast without looking at me. Since we're here so much anyway. Daniel agrees it's more efficient. I looked at Daniel. He didn't look up from his phone. I understood in that moment, with total clarity, that this wasn't drifting anymore. This was a plan, and it had a shape, and the shape was absorb the house, absorb the finances, and eventually absorb the child into a structure controlled entirely by people who had already shown me, through a rearranged pantry and a canceled doula and a key I never agreed to give out, that they considered consent optional where I was concerned. I had, according to Amara, roughly 24 hours before Patricia's formalizing conversation with Daniel turned into paperwork. An actual company resolution, Amara warned, could be drafted and pushed through the following week if Patricia moved as fast as she historically had with family decisions. Once that resolution existed, unwinding it would mean months of litigation instead of a clean negotiated exit. It had to happen now, or it would take a year, and Charlotte would spend that year in a house where I had no legal footing at all. That night, I didn't sleep in 90-minute increments. I didn't sleep at all. I sat with Charlotte on my chest in the dark nursery, and I called Amara at 11 p.m., and she answered on the first ring because she'd been waiting for the call. I need to know what happens if I do nothing, I said. I need to know exactly. If you do nothing, Renee, and that resolution passes, you're a resident in a company-owned property with no signed lease agreement in your name, married to a man with undisclosed assets you now have documented proof of, in a state where none of that gets easier to challenge with time. I won't sugarcoat it. Tonight is better than next week. Next week is better than next month. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That surprised me more than anything else that night. That somewhere between the bacon and the ledger and Priya's calm, steady voice reading out dollar amounts, the fear had turned into something colder and more usable. Tell me what to do, I said. Here is what we did, and I'm laying it out plainly because I think the mechanics matter more than the drama. Amara drafted, that same night, a formal written notice to Voss Brothers Development, care of Patricia as company officer, asserting my legal interest as an occupant and spouse, demanding immediate cessation of unauthorized entry to the residence, and putting the company on notice that any further formalization of household management without my written consent would be treated as an attempt to interfere with marital property rights. It was hand-delivered by a process server to Patricia's home at 8 a.m. the next morning. Not out of cruelty, Amara explained, but because a notice delivered informally could later be disputed as never having been properly received. This one couldn't be. Simultaneously, Priya finalized her preliminary forensic report and forwarded it, at my instruction, to my own attorney's office as a protected work product. Not yet to Daniel, not yet to anyone at the company, but built and dated and ready, the way you position a fire extinguisher before you need it rather than after. I also did something Amara specifically advised, which surprised me at the time. I called Marisol, our housekeeper, and I asked her gently whether she'd be willing to speak honestly on the record about what she'd witnessed regarding Patricia's unsupervised access to the house. Marisol didn't hesitate. She told me once, Marisol said, that I worked for the family, not for you specifically. I didn't like it. I'm glad you're asking. Amara took a signed statement from her that same week. By Friday morning, 18 hours after the notice was delivered, the house had gone from the low simmer of the past month to something closer to open war, except I wasn't shouting. I was, for the first time in 9 weeks, completely calm, because I finally had ground under my feet that someone else couldn't quietly move. Daniel confronted me in the nursery, voice low so as not to wake Charlotte, though his hands weren't as controlled as his voice. You had a lawyer deliver something to my mother's house? Do you understand what you've done? She's talking about pulling back the renovation support for Kimberly's kitchen entirely because of this. Do you know how that looks? I know exactly how it looks, Daniel. It looks like a company built by your family used a key I never agreed to give anyone in a house I never signed for, while you hid $340,000 from me over 3 years. That's how it looks. His face did something I hadn't seen before, a kind of controlled collapse, the mask slipping in real time. That money was for, it was going to be a surprise for the house for, don't, I said. Priya has the account records. She has the dates. It's not a surprise if I only find out about it by breaking into a filing cabinet. He didn't have an answer for that. that. It was, I think, the first time in our entire marriage that I'd watched him run out of a deflection to reach for. The following 2 weeks moved fast, in the specific way that institutional processes move once the paperwork finally exists to make them move. Boss Brothers Development's outside counsel, a firm the company had used for decades, reached out to Amara within 4 days of the notice, clearly having reviewed both the demand letter and, I suspect, having heard secondhand about Priya's involvement, because their tone shifted almost immediately from dismissive to careful. Companies, I learned, are far more afraid of a documented forensic accounting trail than they are of a daughter-in-law's hurt feelings. Detective work wasn't part of this story in the way you might expect from a crime thriller. Nobody was arrested, nothing here was a criminal matter in the way a break-in or an assault would be. But there was, in fact, a fourth professional who entered the picture at Amara's recommendation. Harold Bissett, a mediator with over 20 years of experience specifically in family business property disputes. Brought in because both sides, once lawyers were involved, wanted to avoid a costly and public court fight over the house and the company's equity structure. Harold's first session, held in a conference room at Amara's firm, was the first time I'd been in a room with Daniel and Patricia where I was treated, structurally, as an equal party rather than staff. Priya's report sat on the table in a bound copy in front of every chair. Nobody argued with the numbers. There was nothing to argue with. Priya had traced every dollar to a dated, verifiable source. What emerged over 3 mediation sessions was this. The lease-to-own arrangement on the house was voided, replaced by a new deed transferring full ownership jointly to Daniel and me. No company stake, no company key. Daniel agreed to a full accounting of the previously undisclosed distributions, with a portion allocated retroactively to joint marital assets as part of a broader financial disclosure agreement, separate, Amara was careful to clarify to me, from whether Daniel and I would ultimately stay married, which was a decision Harold's process deliberately didn't touch. And Patricia, after Marisol's signed statement was formally entered into the mediation record, confirming a documented history of unauthorized entry, agreed, in writing, to relinquish any keys, codes, or standing access to the property permanently. I want to be honest about something here because I think it's the part people expect me to skip. Daniel and I did not, in that period, decide whether we were staying married. That question outlived the mediation. What the process actually resolved was narrower and, in some ways, more important. It resolved whose house this was, whose money this was, and whose consent mattered going forward, regardless of what happened to the marriage itself. Patricia's reputation within the family took the hit I imagine she feared most from the start. Kimberly, once she read Marisol's statement, stopped speaking to her mother for several weeks, not out of loyalty to me, particularly, but because, as she told me once, stiffly, over a strained cup of coffee, I didn't know she was doing that to you. I thought it was just her being intense. I didn't know it was planned. It was planned. That's the word Priya's report kept circling back to, gently but unmistakably in the language of financial forensics, a pattern consistent with deliberate structuring, not an accident, not over-involvement from love, a structure built over years to keep control of a house, a company, and eventually, I believe, a granddaughter, entirely within Patricia's hands. It's been 11 months since the morning with the bacon. Charlotte is a year old now, walking in the unsteady, delighted way 1-year-olds walk, discovering that furniture can be climbed and that the dog's tail is fascinating and mostly off limits. She has Daniel's eyes and, everyone tells me, my stubborn chin. Daniel and I are still married, though I won't pretend the year that followed was simple. We went through 8 months of couples counseling. A therapist named Dr. Aline Brooks, who I'll mention here not as a plot device, but because she said something in our 4th session that I've kept with me since. The betrayal your wife describes wasn't really about bacon, Daniel. It was about whether her voice mattered in her own home. The bacon was just the morning it became impossible to ignore. Daniel heard that eventually, in a way I don't think he was capable of hearing it the morning he said my name like an employee's. He sold back his remaining equity stake in Voss Brothers Development a year later. At a fair market valuation, Priya herself was retained to verify, and took a position at an unrelated firm, one where his mother has never once been able to let herself in the back door. Patricia and I are civil now, not close. I don't think we'll ever be close, and I've made a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with weather you can't control but can at least dress appropriately for. She sees Charlotte on a fixed, rearranged schedule now, supervised for the first several months by mutual agreement, a condition I insisted on, and Harold's mediation formalized in writing. She has never again let herself into my house. I went back to work 4 months after Charlotte's birth, part-time at first, now full-time, back in operations, back in the specific, satisfying work of fixing systems that have quietly broken without anyone quite noticing how. I think often about how strange it is that the skill set that makes me good at my job, noticing small inconsistencies, refusing to let a broken process hide behind the word, "that's just how it's always been," is the exact same skill set that let me survive that year at home. I used to think of those as 2 separate parts of my life. I don't anymore. I still cook breakfast some mornings. Charlotte likes eggs, mashed with a fork. No dairy, though nobody's checking anymore whether I got the memo right. Daniel still says my name sometimes in a tone I flinch at. Old muscle memory that hasn't fully faded, but it's different now. He catches himself. He says it again, softer, and means it as my name. Not as a correction, not as a complaint about the bacon. Just my name. That's the ending I have. Not fireworks, not a courtroom drama with a gavel coming down. A deed with both our names on it, spelled correctly this time. A key that no longer exists. A morning, most days now, where nobody looks past me to say good morning to somebody else first. If you've read this far, you've earned knowing that the hardest part was never proving I was right. It was believing at 4:30 in the morning with a spatula in in one hand and my daughter in the other, that I still had the right to be believed at all.